shifting people's thinking is one thing, but then also the actual conditions in which we live in are systemically much more of a factor, I think, in those sort of things. So we can talk all day to each other about the problem without really getting at how we can change an entire society from the ground up. That's not usually how this happens, how it works. History rolls forward. One thing is built on top of another as a reaction to that thing before it. We're talking about 30, 40, 50 years where it's just a complete right turn. How does that happen? And I don't have an answer to that, but that's the question I'm asking, or one of the questions I'm asking. And if I was going to criticize the thing I'm doing with the Cascade, the one problem I do have is that although I don't want to end things with this sort of traditional, and here's why it's actually okay, sort of part of the documentary or the essay. I recognize these problems, but I'm not working towards the and here's how we fix it, because I don't have that. I'd like to have that, but I don't.
Greetings, Future Fossils. I'm your host, Michael Garfield, welcoming you to episode 230 of the podcast that explores our place and time. This week, I'm welcoming Jamie Curcio back onto the show, who appeared for the first time in episode 195 on AI art. This is our first one-on-one for the show, in which we're discussing his Fallen Cycle podcast and Tales from When I Had a Face. Jamie is just a remarkably prolific, interesting, strange, esoteric thinker with whom I identify very deeply. And I'm delighted to pull this one out of the editing queue to share with you now in a week where it feels like a deep, loamy, profound, numinous, challenging time for a lot of people. But it's a good time, if you're into philosophy and art, I think. This week on the show, we ask, whom do we serve? Who gives us power? Where does that power come from? To whom do we sell our stories? And again, I can't think of a more appropriate time to ask these questions than in the wake of the United States presidential election, where I keep hoping every 4 years that people will realize this time, finally, a country of over 300 million people cannot possibly continue to invest our future, to invest our stories in the outcomes of these spectacles. That maybe this time we realize that we do feed powerful beings in realms beyond our control with this displacement of our own narrative agency. And so, yeah, it's a great conversation on the world behind the world, linking Jamie's writing and his game world building in the domain he calls Mythpunk with the equally eldritch complex systems and wicked problems of climate action he explores in his nonfiction essays. Studying that link, we can trace the outlines of emergent 21st century religions, the reinterpretation of axial traditions suited to the digital era, the metamodern revival of land-based animistic traditions, and even weirder novel forms that arise at the end of one world and the efflorescence of so many others. We link between Dionysus and Jesus. We talk about the festival as apocalypse, and of course the bright side of dark ages. It's a good one. I'm glad to share it with you. And to announce that this is the third episode before Future Fossils rebrands as Humans on the Loop at the beginning of December. I have 22 episodes in the can for that one. I am excited to share with you. And you can get a teaser for some of those themes in this conversation, thinking about prompting AI as casting spells and the roles of parenting and of accountability in community, storytelling and decision-making in a collective sense, and the way that we reconstitute ourselves in an age of opaque and magical technologies. So a very cool project, at which point I will continue to record Future Fossils episodes for periodic release on the Substack and Patreon members-only feeds, and I'll start hosting Patreon live community calls starting in December as well. If you want a more intimate engagement with me and the other awesome people in this community, now's a great time to sign up at michaelgarfield.substack.com or patreon.com/michaelgarfield. And thanks to everyone who has been helping pay for groceries and electricity for the last several years and helping me keep this show going as a listener-supported program, stubbornly resistant to ad revenue. So with that, everybody, thanks and enjoy this conversation with the weird, the wonderful Jamie Curcio. Jamie, welcome on board. Thanks for being so super extremely patient with me as we have rescheduled this approximately 500 times.
Yeah, I'm happy we're able to finally connect at the same place, or well, not place, but time.
Yeah. So for folks who don't have the inside track on this, you appeared in one of the most personally referenced episodes of this show ever, 195, which was our sort of Fellowship of the Ring conversation 2 or 2.5 years ago about artists using generative AI, and where we sat on some of the moral complexities surrounding that. And I'm not going to belabor that point in our conversation today because we're in a different world. But I do want to sink some hooks into that conversation at different points in talking about the projects that you've got at the top of your multivalent life feed right now. But first, introduce yourself to people, because really we only did that in passing the last time I had you on the show.
Sure. Yeah, well, my name is Jamie Curcio. My books are published as James Curcio, which is another story. But as indicated, I've got a kind of jack of all trades thing going on, which turns out to have been at least partially undiagnosed neurodivergence. But there is a through line through most of my work, which is that I could tell this story 5 different ways and it would be true, but framed a little differently. And so that's the connection really in all my work, is it's all founded in narrative and storytelling, but the way that narrative and storytelling actually affect the world that we live in. So when I was in high school, I started playing role-playing games, and that was actually one of the ways I started making friends, really. I was an only child and kind of a loner when I was young, and then became much more social through telling stories with people about make-believe characters that we were playing. And then I guess a couple years later, someone my mom knew gave her like a huge collection of Joseph Campbell lecture videos, VHS, and I watched through all of them. And there's certainly some room for criticism in terms of his approach about the monomyth, but in terms of like introducing kids to all the stuff that's out there, I definitely felt a debt of gratitude from that, because it got me into Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and Buddhism and Taoism and Western esotericism and all sort of things, which many of which I already started to get into, but I think helped get me on that track. And then college, I started a psych major, and then I was asked by the head of the department to become a philosophy major because I was engaging in so many debates with the professors about the role of culture and systems and the construction of mental health diagnostics and that sort of thing, which was always, yes, that's true, but let's get back to the DSM or whatever.
We have a place for people like you.
Right, exactly. It's the philosophy department. Go there and talk to them around your round table or whatever. And by the time I graduated, I co-founded a kind of art collective media production company with a bunch of people I knew from college at Bard called Evolving Media Network. And the plan there was to do work for corporations by day, pharma companies and stuff like that, and then use the money we made from that to fund the work that was actually more interesting or more useful. But for whatever reason, that stuff never seems to be the stuff that makes money, or at least very much of it. And that pattern's held for 20 years in a way. Like, I've been involved in a ton of different startups of various kinds in the sort of media, well, transmedia, art, journalism sort of space. Unfortunately, a lot of those, especially ones from like the 2000s and even some of the 2010s, are just gone now because the internet, supposedly everything happens there for forever, but in practice, it's gone so fast. Maybe on a hard drive somewhere. But so yeah, it's been the basic trajectory. But of course, in there, I played music. I write books, I've worked on comics. And so it seems like it's all over the place, but all it does loop back to that point about narrative. And there is an overlap also, which we might get to a little bit about. Well, there's an inflection point for me. It happened at a really funny point because I picked up a book on a friend's bookshelf, Delanda's 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History. I don't know if you've heard of it or not.
I haven't read it.
It's a good book, but it completely flipped the script on me, because up to that point, I was very immersed in the Gnostic idealism point of view, like everything traced back to thought and the mind and concepts. And it shifted to framing things in terms of non-reductive, largely nonlinear, systems-based perspective, but materialism, but not the reductive materialism. You cut up the world into these little atoms. It's the opposite perspective of materialism. It's a systems complexity sort of basis of materialism. But that book, in and of itself, maybe wasn't the only thing, but it was definitely the turning point for me. And so that's become the non-fiction part of my work has been heavily influenced by that. So I guess now I'm a quote unquote materialist, but not in the way that a lot of people seem to think that means.
Yeah. So just to establish where I see us, you and I have had now years of moral support or solidarity. Just for folks that are only listening to this, you have a tattoo of the interrobang on your arm.
Yeah. And also, although it's faded, you can see the tree of life on there too, and on Kabbalah.
Yeah. So I don't know if I ever told you this, but when I was in college, my buddies said that if I were a punctuation mark, I would be an exclamation point. I said, but I feel like a question mark. And that's around the time that I was studying integral philosophy and starting to think in a meta-perspectival frame. So that's actually how I discovered that the interrobang even existed, because I was like, what is that thing that if you turn it one way, it looks like a question. If you turn it another way, it looks like an answer. And there's something about that I see riddled through your work. I just want to read real quickly a couple of brief excerpts from a piece that you have pinned to the top of your Medium account. You have this piece, it's the end note from your book, Tales from When I Had a Face, called Investing in the Unknown. People who listen to the show a lot know that I am deeply preoccupied with this issue of legibility, which I guess links into your point about being interested in systems and the language of systems science, systems thinking, and how the vantage lines that converge on the horizon where I think you and I both meet intellectually is in the fact that that horizon is something we can never reach, and that the models that we use, the economic frameworks that we use are always missing something. And so like you say it really elegantly here, you say the occult, science, and art arose from the same spring, not in certainty, but in uncertainty, that each begins with retaining space for the unknown. And then later you say there is no solid ground under our feet, and it is our beliefs that often obscure how precarious our vantage point is and what a drop there is beyond it, even as they lead us right to the edge. I've heard you on, and we'll link to your conversation with the hosts of Weird Studies, JF and Phil, and the work that you were doing then. And there is this piece out of Reclaiming Art in the Age of Artifice, the book, where he's talking about symbols and how the symbol is that kind of mask for a JF loves Gilles Deleuze and this notion of the rhizome, and how like everything is connected to everything else behind, but that we can never really tease out all of the subterranean rhizomal relationships. And so when you say investing in the unknown, it's funny because it has that quality that, like, my buddy Tom Morgan, who came on the show for 221, used to write for Sapient Capital about how the real high yield investments are in places that other people aren't investing because they think it's crazy. And so, the yarn ball here has to do with the way that I appreciate how you use myth not as artifice that functions as a vehicle for propaganda or moralizing, but as a way to draw our attention to the sort of transcendental mystery within which the systems of knowledge that we weave together are basically just a raft upon this oceanic mindfuck that I feel is captured so well in the punctuation mark you have tattooed on your arm. So
yeah, there's an element of Buddhism in that too, the raft that gets you from one side to the other. I hate to mention him, but it's funny when you mentioned the interrobang, the first thing that came to mind was Aleister Crowley's essay, The Soldier and the Hunchback, which I haven't read in years, but I remember one of the central premise of it is that an immediate kind of back and forth between the assertion and then the question, and then the assertion and the question. And it's, if you get stuck on one, because it's like the becoming thing, you can always deepen that and find other complexities that tie to other things. So when you stop, it's not the thing stopping its use of things. There's always more lurking behind it. The whole masks all the way down idea. As being made, when I was on JF on Weird Studies, I was maybe a little bit rhetorical in a way. I think they caught that though, where saying that everything is artifice and that it's all masks all the way down. But I was trying to make this point that when you think you found the final thing, that's the best sign that you haven't, in a way. So I assert that, while at the same time, I'm not saying we should try to be artificial. It's the opposite in a way. It's you're trying to find the deeper mask, but also recognizing the sort of, I don't want to say futility, because the point isn't to find the end. I think that's the shift that has to happen ultimately, is that when it becomes about the process. So.
Yeah, it's funny because after staying up listening to your new podcast until 4 a.m. last night, we're recording this kind of hot on the heels of the theatrical release of Alien Romulus. And so I was binging on YouTube all of the fan videos about all of the recent Alien films. And so I'm going to apologize in advance for making this connection, because it's, oh my God, he's talking about this again. But one of the things that I really appreciated about the film Prometheus, that so many people panned it for being obscenely over-explanatory. Even Eric Wargo says, they took this amazing mystery of this fossilized spaceship alien pilot, and then they gave it this sort of pornographic, well, this is what's going on kind of account. To which is one of those things that I love whenever I can disagree with Eric, because it's rare to find someone about with which I agree so much. But I actually think that there's that scene in the film where they finally find the engineer of the species that ostensibly created humankind through biotechnology, and they go to ask it. Peter Whalen goes to ask the question. And originally in the script, there was a whole conversation that happened there where great answers are revealed, and they cut it all out. And the encounter that they have with their God or their creator being is of querying a silence. The behavior of this thing, then it responds instead with shocking and inexplicable violence. And so love that, because contrary to the way people typically interpret this film, I think, though it seems as though it explains some things that people enjoyed being left unknown, that Wargo's problem with this is John Keats's problem with Newton, the unweaving the rainbow with the science of optics. And that, not that I always side with Richard Dawkins, but I appreciate Dawkins's point in his book, Unweaving the Rainbow, that actually answering these questions only draws us further into an even deeper mystery. And that Prometheus was a film made by a director in the last act of his career, and was stubbornly refusing to give people what they wanted out of a prequel. It was he's no, I'm just going to throw all this weird random crap at you, and you're just going to have to deal with this explosive expansion to the lore and the speculation. And anyway, bringing it back to your work,
That's right.
There's this tension between your non-fictional writing, and I want to get into the 3-part essay that you wrote on the Cascade and climate change, even though it's a total bummer, and how you hold that tension with the kind of stuff that you're doing with the Fallen Cycle Mythos fiction podcast. And it strikes me as a really important kind of diastole and systole in sense making this mystery. So I'd love to just give you a chance to riff on that before we actually address the specific work objects we want to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's something I noticed only, I don't know, in the last 5 or 6 years, but there's been a pattern for quite a long time where I will work on one nonfiction project and then a fiction project and back and forth. And they tend to mirror each other in some ways. And it wasn't intentional at least for a while, until I realized a lot of things I was working on in essays that became narrative machines were also at the roots of Party at the World's End. And with Tales, it was with Mask. So I have been in dialogue with myself with that and have those tensions in myself. But I don't know if tension's quite the right word, but it is a dialectic, right? Whenever I go too far into nonfiction, I tend to feel like I'm reducing things and trying to define them and saying that and being led astray by that. And then fiction opens up in a way. And that's something I appreciate about it. But then it can also start to feel navel-gazy when I spend too much time just working in the fiction space, which maybe is why I've come full circle in a way back to role-playing games as a way to interact with people and engage with people with these things and try to bring some of the kind of quote-unquote deeper level stuff into a game, or what we call a game, and also have that level of surprise and engagement with other people. It's felt for Prometheus, it's funny, actually, I agree with you about the way it raises more questions than answers them, really. And whenever it answers something, it tends to be in a way that just raises more questions. If I have a criticism of it, it's much more about the characters. Their motivations don't make a whole lot of sense to me in some places, but that's a different criticism.
Yeah, actually, just in passing, and just to button that thing up before we move on, when Evan Snyder and I talked about the Ridley Scott prequels back in 2017, the sympathetic interpretation I'm willing to give them is that these are people that live so deep inside of an advanced technological infrastructure, inside of an opaque, machinic, hyper-capitalistic, hyper-modernistic domain, that you would frankly expect them to be idiots. That there is a sense in which, the more we become embedded in and dependent on the hyperobject of the technium or whatever, the more sort of childlike or the less capable we seem to be at fending for ourselves. And so it made sense in a way to plunk that kind of classic horror trope of people just making extremely stupid decisions in this, because that's where we are. And that's actually something that you talk about in your nonfictional writing about climate change and how hard it is for us to make the behavioral changes that we need to make. Right. And then also it speaks to this thing about agency and what agency really means. Accountability is relative to our ability to account, right? And when we're dealing with forces that are beyond our understanding, then the question of our responsibility or our self-determination becomes really weird and tangled. And so this is where I would love to draw into the orbit of the podcast. Let's start by just letting you set the scene for however much you feel like you want to lay out in front of this very trippy story, which, for the record, again, whether you're talking about climate change or you're talking about tree spirits, and I love the term mythpunk world building, there's a disclaimer in your show that I really appreciate, which is that it may lead to psychosis. It's right there. I felt myself teetering last night at 3 a.m. listening to this stuff. And I think that's actually the label's on the can, and that's a feature. It's not a bug.
Right. Yeah. It's a joke, but also not. Yeah. So the Fallen Cycle Mythos podcast, basically what I'm doing is creating audio editions of the stories I've written so far for the Fallen Cycle. And then my hope is that by the time we get to the end of the Party at the World's End, there'll be enough of an interest to legitimize continuing to do the many more stories we've been developing. I like to use role-playing games more as a springboard. It's not like I'm interested in being like exactly what happened in the session, trying to transcribe it. That's not interesting to me. I'm sure it's not interesting to the average listener, but in terms of developing characters and arcs and so on, it's a great way to spitball. It's like having a writer's room with rules of the sort. So that's my hope with it ultimately. But yeah, right now the story that we're dealing with is Tales from When I Had a Face. We've taken on the kind of entirely mad plan of having it all set to original or semi-original soundtrack, which Dave Bessel's been really helping out with that. He does a lot of soundtrack work. But still, it's Tales from When I Had a Face is probably going to be, I don't know, 7 hours, 6 hours in total runtime. So that's like a lot of music to produce. So we'll see. We're going to try to keep it up. So far, it's been going better even than expected with that. But see, with Party at the World's End, music is integrated with the story in a way because it's a story about these sort of people who are labeled as terrorists, and they started a band basically touring on the road after escaping from that. And it's a lot more kind of hijinksy in a way than Tales. Tales is much more somber. So it'll be a change of tone. But I'm not sure yet how we're going to integrate music with that, because it might be fun to have a full kind of band performance of some of the tracks of the like fictional band play, but we'll see. It's a pretty high goal.
So when we're talking about, again, as you put it, the various sort of domains of human knowledge emerging from this, or whatever, this spring, an unconscious, there is, I don't know how much of this story you want to lay plain for people, but I say this as what I hope is really high praise, that Stephen Batchelor, in one of his books on Buddhism, said that we misuse the term originality, that we use it to mean that someone has done something the world has never seen before, whereas etymologically it means that through this person's work we can see into the origin. And I think there are ways that both in the decisions you've made in actually telling the story, like the way that you've chosen tools and the sort of operation of the storytelling, but then also in the symbolism of this work, that you are aiming, like we were saying earlier, down through the roots of the world tree and into the black, loamy, mysterious stuff. And so, yeah, however much you feel cool guiding us into that world.
Basically, the format for it is starts out with a grandmother telling a story to her granddaughter of a very fantastical kind of alternate history to what her mother tells origins in her grandmother's story is. And so it becomes this ongoing kind of dichotomy between the story that she's told by the society and world around her in the 2000s, I think, is when that section of the book is set in historically. And her grandmother's story, which is like occurs in Alteron, the second world, which is the sort of juncture point between the land of dreams and land of the dead and our world. So the first half of the book is framed around that ongoing, the young girl gets older, her grandmother gets older, her grandmother dies, and then the story kind of flips. We haven't got there yet, but that's when it becomes more about Aicha's story, because her gran has passed on, and now she has to rectify these sort of different sort of myths into the world that she's living in, and how that goes. And of course, it goes tragically because it's a story.
So yeah, there are some kind of recognizable figures in this, or motifs, one being the invocation of Lilith, one being the notion
comes back a lot later.
Yeah, spirits bound into a tree, like Aku in Samurai Jack, or Hexus in Fern Gully, like this kind of ongoing motif. And then also that there's something about, like, I'm probably not as steeped in mythological literature as you are, so my comparisons might be a bit impoverished, but I was getting strong vibes of Tom Robbins' Jitterbug Perfume, or Neil Gaiman's American Gods, in the sense of the way that live in relationship with beings that depend on our service, our attention, our sacrifice. And yeah, I'd like to hear whom do you think you are feeding with the work of this storytelling?
That's a hard question to answer for me for whatever reason, but I can say that those figures you're talking about do they become delineated much more clearly in Party at the World's End to a certain extent. And then hopefully in later stories where there are 12 of them, they're called the Fallen, and they are like the gods in American Gods in some ways, or the Manless in Sandman. And there's definitely inspirations. It's gone beyond that in some ways, but it started out with the 12 astrological signs and the triple cities of the zodiac that feed that. And then looking at the pattern of kind of popular characters, I don't have the list in front of me, but I made a kind of master list of fictional characters who correspond to each of the archetypes, each of the Fallen. So then this will become part of it, or is becoming part of the system for their RPG. So you have these sort of archetypes that you can embody. And also this idea of the Fallen in particular are basically a juncture where spirits in the void and the underworld influence certain people. And then those people gain certain benefits from that influence, but there's also a certain kind of curse to it in a way too, because their own story then becomes entrapped in the underworld and feeds that archetype, makes that archetype more powerful, as opposed to their spirit being recapitulated in the cycle, which is a more Buddhist, Tibetan sort of thing, where normally a human spirit goes into the land of the dead and is heard by one of these spirits called the Fein, and they basically eat your story, and they're sustained by it. But then, at least according to them, it's a benefit to us as well, because that story would keep us stuck in the land of the dead. But without being burdened by the story, you can return to a new life and be recycled in that way. So it's a take on on reincarnation in a way, but of course it's almost the opposite of reincarnation, or at least I guess you say American or Western version of reincarnation, because there's no you that's being recycled. There's no memories that are being recycled. It's Tibetan, it's the grasping that's recycled.
I want to dip out here because there's an interesting through line to a point that you make in this 3-part essay. I remember when you were writing this and you were posting about the dance you were engaged in with the abyss of taking so much more time to read climate science briefings and research. And this kind of stuff puts you in this position that people like Josh Schrei talks about the role of the seer in cultures throughout history and the marginal identity of the people that are willing to peer over the edge. And there's a point in the first part of the Cascade where you say, we don't have leaders, we have vested interests. That is, financial ones. Fact must be considered first and foremost in any discussion of solutions. It must also be assumed that many so-called solutions entail their own devil's bargain, particularly when it is sold to us by a corporation. And so I know that if I think back to like conversations I've had with Chris Ryan in 178, the way that even he, in a very mundane, secular sense, as an anthropologist, is looking at human institutions as these Lovecraftian entities. In a similar way, right, the beings to which we are selling our stories to be. Yeah,
the idea of corporations being their own sort of form of AI, long before an LLM was a thing. Yeah.
Right. So this is just an invitation to dig out a little more context on the climate work and help people feel through a kind of theoretical / emotional resonance between these two things we've already linked.
That's a challenging thing even to talk about, but also just emotionally. But it's just, I had to talk about it because for so long I've been frustrated by the fact that there are a lot of really great advances that are being made, especially in terms of solar energy and growing awareness about climate change and that sort of thing. But it's not only that it's not happening fast enough, but it's also that there's this sort of disconnect between technological or engineering solutions, or looking at it as an engineering problem, and then recognizing what we do as a society and the sort of inertia of the systems that we have in place. The simplest version of it being like, you can think what you think about having gasoline running your car and having a car and all that sort of stuff, but you have to get to work and you got to get your groceries. And that's what the environment provides for you to work within. And perhaps you as an individual might be able to make certain sacrifices to not do that. But societally, that's not viable, obviously. And so it's like, where does the tire meet the road with that sort of problem? Obviously, cars aren't alone the single kind of silver bullet solution for climate change, but especially in America, where kind of the culture and mythology of the car is so central, like in places where a lot of places there could be better public transit, and then there's some restrictions on that are systemic, but then there are also just the fact that culturally people a lot of times will not take public transit, even when it is available. So shifting people's thinking is one thing, but then also the actual conditions in which we live in are systemically much more of a factor, I think, in those sort of things. So we can talk all day to each other about the problem without really getting at how we can change an entire society from the ground up. That's not usually how this happens, how it works. History rolls forward. One thing is built on top of another as a reaction to that thing before it. We're talking about 30, 40, 50 years where it's just a complete right turn. How does that happen? And I don't have an answer to that, but that's the question I'm asking, or one of the questions I'm asking. And if I was going to criticize the thing I'm doing with the cascade, the one problem I do have is that although I don't want to end things with this sort of traditional, and here's why it's actually okay, sort of part of the documentary or the essay, I recognize these problems, but I'm not working towards the and here's how we fix it, because I don't have that. I'd like to have that, but I don't.
Well, I don't know if you heard the conversation I had with Tim Morton on the show recently about their new book, Hell, in Search of a Christian Ecology. But you cite Tim and you cite this idea of hyperobjects in this essay. And as you put it in the third part of this essay, consequently, even when free to act in all the ways we can, our array of choices may present an incredibly restricted and conditioned actual range of motion. That you say, we need to recognize that the solution can't simply be additive, despite the fact that it seems common sense that if I change certain behaviors and so do my friends and neighbors on down the line, a sort of top-up effect must take hold. There's something going on here. It's like this question of Tim points to the mythic structure of Christianity and how we can leverage the affordances of the Christian mythos in a postmodern era to reclaim a felt sense of the sacred that overwhelms the incentives and the prioritization of trying to find technological and economic solutions. I see it everywhere in your work that when we're talking about the ritual of lifestyle consumerism, you're operating with a constraint space. And as you talk about in this piece, how are things going to change when the change starts to pick up and more millions of people are displaced by the zone of uninhabitability moving poleward?
Right.
Well, it sounds very Exodus to me, right? Like it sounds very much like what we're really talking about is moving out of a realm of sense and of the solutionist thinking that you and Timothy Morton both indict, and into something more like the constrained ritualistic behavior that governs the actions of your characters as they traverse these underworld spaces in your fictional work. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that observation, but there's a luminosity to the self-terminating fulfillment of the modern project here, that in this reckoning with the reality that this is not our dominion, that we are ultimately organisms that are serving weird, often terrible things that exist beyond us, that
and it's out of time in a weird way.
Yeah, that we actually are able to reclaim something of the religion that we lost in our effort to transcend all possible barriers and obstacles and constraints.
Maybe. Yeah, it's an interesting connection with the fiction work. And I'll say one of the things that we started working on with a previous fiction podcast, The Witch Doctor, that takes place after the fall, in the sense of after the civilization loses its memory of itself. There's still maybe some thumb drive you can find somewhere, but what are you going to read it on? And now it's 500 years old. It's broken, right? So all that record of what happened, what came before is gone. And you have this resurgence of certain patterns that have happened previously in human history, but of course, it's a new version of it. And the question there is it just a recapitulation or is it like a new way forward? That, of course, is beyond the vision of people in the world and society today. When 100 years, if things progress as they are, in the real world, I could see that sort of schism happening. I'm not saying it will, but it's certainly a possibility. But I find myself very compelled to wonder about that new humanity, if you will, if we can get through this bottleneck. So in a way, it's like the optimistic side of it is almost like through that eye of the needle. It's through that Exodus is, a good way of putting it.
Just to really embellish this point, I think it's perfect that folks watching this conversation can see that you've got this... you've made this poster of the Saganic temple, rather that it's a Carl Sagan in this hilarious kind of ironic...
it was from an art installation that me and my friend Daniel did at some like festivals and stuff with like projections and these things up. It was a wacky idea, but it wound up having a 4-hour video projection thing that Daniel had put together for it and stuff to make the Church of Carl Sagan. And
it's there. It's in his writing on the demon haunted world. Like this thing that we're talking about looks like the evil we're trying to avoid. But Tim Horton's point is that having the choice to disobey the commandments, to actually embrace the body and its pleasures, is in a deep way to the futurality or the pure contingency that's there in the gospel, like in the promise of Christ for redemption. And that in a weird way, I think a lot of I am not myself a doomer, but I think it's largely because I think there's this like relationship between the way that like psychoanalysis talks about the death drive and this desire to transcend the limiting framework in which we operate, in which we are, like, in this case, forced to regard ourselves as national citizens or as capitalist consumers or as people with jobs or whatever. And that there's a freedom and a release in returning to something that is a bit more transparently mysterious and untamed.
It's funny, it's been a little while since I've done reading on this, but there are a lot of connections between Dionysus and Jesus. And also the first places where I've seen sort of glimmers of this, although in a kind of, dissociated framework where it's hard to imagine it becoming like culturally viable, but is at festivals, is in the festival space where people break these patterns. But by design, you can't really bring Burning Man home and probably shouldn't. So there is that sort of thing about it, part of the festival space, even like in a sort of more ritualistic sense. What distinguishes it is specifically being distinct from the everyday space. It's the place where kings and his subjects are the same level, that sort of thing, right? So there's something there, and that's part of what led me to keep returning to the super festival events. Unfortunately, the pandemic has put a kibosh on that. I got long COVID, and I'm wary of crowds these days, both from that and also just habitually now I'm more used to the small groups or solo meditation. But
this brings me to the sort of last big chunk I wanted to discuss with you. There's a sort of reciprocity or mutuality between this: don't bring Burning Man home, don't try to infuse your everyday life with the liminal space and its possibility, which again is like very much the sort of Promethean point that Ridley Scott is making about maybe you're not supposed to be trying to use this black goo, which is like metamorphosis incarnate. Maybe the point is not to productize that and turn it into some sort of medical biotechnology, try to constrain it all in a system. And then this conversation I was just having on Twitter earlier today with someone who was saying, I don't think it's a good idea to monetize your passions. I've certainly made that mistake. I'm doing it right now with the podcast, right? And like that's another sort of purgatorial space in which you and I meet. And so holding that, I want to bring it back to this question about method with you and the ways in which you chose to explore and to use generative AI in telling this story, in part because like Josh Schrey and Tim Morton and many other people have said, there is a sense in which prompting an opaque language model, trying to get it to work for you as a productivity enhancement instrument, is very mythologically linked to signing on the dotted line in blood.
I would say there might be some truth to that, but not any more so than so many of the other ways that we engage with corporations. That's where the split is for me in terms of how I use it and don't use it. That isn't fully explicative of all the possible uses for it, and certainly isn't like how a corporation will use it. Like, I look at it differently if a multi-billion-dollar corporation uses AI to lay off all their voice actors, for instance, whereas I, running a small independent project, use text-to-speech because I can't hire voice actors to do the kind of work that I want them to be able to do with it. I could do it myself with my friends, but it's not going to be quite on the level. So I look at that differently, right? And I think more people should parse it based on their own use. But still, there is true that when you engage with a system, a lot of times the repercussions of that go beyond the context of your use. I do think that it's important to open that up to all the other ways that we engage with corporations and all the ways that we sublimate our ethical sort of investment in those systems. For instance, the clothes I'm wearing, I haven't followed the provenance of them, like shoes, how it was sewed, where the fabric came from, and so on. But I've done enough research on that sort of thing to find that if you go far enough, quite a lot of times it leads to like child slavery or any number of other horrible things that I think most people would agree are horrible. But and yet I'm wearing the shirt, right? So that's something we all have to wrestle with and come up with different answers to.
What was behind your decision to use AI for certain parts of this and to use human collaborators for other parts? And then, because right now, if you needed 7 hours of music, you can go hash that out with Suno or Cassette or any of these services, Udio. But then there's this other piece, which is like, where we started this conversation, there is an element of mystery and uncertainty and surprise in leveraging these tools. And I'm curious about where you found yourself surprised. Why did you make the decisions you did? And what so far have you recognized as the ways in which it turned out that you were employing a far livelier tool that's become more of a collaborator in the process of your storytelling?
In some ways, I definitely have discovered that I tend to use them in a very different way from a lot of people seem to. And, as an example, with an image program like Midjourney, a lot of people seem to think of it as, what's the prompt? The prompt. What's the prompt to get this result? And it's no. Whenever I get to something I'm even using in a comp, it's probably hundreds of iterations. And that's the interesting point of me for is tweaking something, seeing the results, saying that one is more interesting than that one or closer, or perhaps there's something in that I wasn't even thinking of. And let's work on that. Add these words in here, change the weighting on this thing, change the style reference, whatever, and just keep iterating. And the risk for me feels more in a creative sense, seems more like having Control Z or having anything that adds to options. Like it's good to have more options, but it's also bad. Where it's, okay, now I have 1,000 comps, right? And all of them are actually pretty good. Which one's the right one? That's where it becomes more challenging to me than being stuck on one thing. It's nice being able to not be too precious about any one result and to see it as an experiment. I guess that's the other side of it is if you look at it as an oracle that knows truth of any sort or as a final destination, I think that's where you can get into a lot of problems. Putting the ethical stuff aside, just creatively, like it's basically a pattern recognition machine that basically takes those patterns and then tries to produce more like the parameters that you're giving it. So I don't think about it like I'm talking to a person, certainly. It's funny though, when I started prompting, this is true even more with ChatGPT because you can actually set your parameters in a funny way. But the thing it taught me, the first way to go about it was actually Star Trek. Like in Star Trek TNG, and when they'll be in the holodeck and be like, okay, like that, but change that. Okay, computer, actually this thing. And so it's that sort of back and forth engagement with it of that sort seems definitely like the starting point. You can go a lot deeper than that, but trying to get your results with one step isn't going to cut it.
Just again, to tie it back into your fiction, the Raven Man is a kind of like a prominent character here.
Again, yeah. The conversations
that your characters have with this figure traversing a shifting desert landscape where I like in the episode description for this latest episode that you have out, like I'm not privy to the conclusion of this story, but it sounds to me like there's a way in which art is imitating life is imitating art here. As they traverse the sun-scorched wilderness, the whisper of prophecies and the weight of destiny loom large, setting a tone of both anticipation and dread. Then the portents that have been spoken of become all too real. It's, well, hey, here we are. So, yeah, it's not really a question.
No. It does make me think, though, that becomes true within the story, where the portents become true within Grant's story. But then later in the book, those portents become real in a way where they actually come into the real world. Aita falls in love with someone Nissa, who recognizes as a character in a Grant stories, and that's where the rupture starts to open up of like, where is the line here?
Do you worry at all about hyperstition with this stuff? Because you're talking about like masks all the way down, masks all the way up. And if you are playing with metafictional tropes in your work and you're engaged in magical workings and you're thinking about the influence of myth on the structure of thought and behavior, and you're actually having people play this stuff out in a role-playing game, where do you...
It's funny you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Because we really haven't even touched on it, but it's become less of a kind of keyword nowadays. But I was involved in a lot of transmedia and alternate reality game projects. And I work with Joseph Matheny, who did Ong's Hat. I don't know if you've heard of Ong's Hat, but it's like one of the perennial kind of quote unquote texts in that space, where I created a semi-fictional location with a mythology around it, and people started engaging with it as if it was real. So yeah, no, that's definitely been a long thread in my work. Maybe it sounds too glib, but I don't feel like I've had too many issues arise with that in my own experience, but it certainly is a danger when it comes out into the wider world, especially because you don't control how people interpret the work or how people might realize it figuratively or literally. So I have thought about that, but I guess it's still what I do. They do slip in those little warnings that are half jokes, like you mentioned, this may cause psychosis, etc. There's a little watchword of it if you take it, like you should take it seriously, but in the realm of fiction, the way that fiction informs our lives, and it does, but not to literalize it. Even my nonfiction work, I worry sometimes about people literalizing it too much.
I guess just writing on this, and I'm totally off the rails into speculative terrain. I've been talking with a lot of people lately about Cindy Kuhn here in New Mexico does threat casting and future casting with a lot of 3-letter agencies and brings people together into these perspectively diverse groups to engage in the derivation of speculative fictions about particular scenarios as a way of like harnessing the wisdom of the crowd. And there's a link there with being the quote unquote dungeon master. If I were to treat you as a language model, I might prompt, how can the kit that you're playing with serve to catalyze social processes that might help answer some of the questions that you're holding about the actual futures that we might be about to live through? Is there a way that we can use role-playing and mythology to traverse the 40 years in the desert we have ahead of us?
Well, I think it can help us to ask better questions more than find answers. But I think that in terms of the actual help thing, in a way, it's like relearning a method of storytelling and sharing stories with people. And one of the things I love about running RPGs and playing them, but I guess my natural role has always been the group TM, is to like the fact that after we've run this story, after we've gone to its end, we all have these memories, and we'll like years later even still have the jokes and the like references to, oh, this character. Of course, no one else knows like what that reference is. So you have that shared language. So I find a value more in developing shared language with people. Maybe there's a way that it could have a kind of a larger scale sort of effect societally. I'm not sure, but definitely within the context of that group that you're playing with, quote unquote, playing, you're developing not only a shared language with them, but also memories. And you learn things about each other from the characters that you play. Although my favorite groups to play with, most people don't generally just do self-inserts with their characters. It's not like this character is me, but he's cooler, or he's got more cool hair, whatever. I think we all have had those campaigns, and sometimes they can be fun if it's explicit competency porn or whatever it's called. But it's more like you take a part of yourself and exaggerate it to the point where it's not you anymore and change it and see where that goes. And you find things about yourself, but even more so about the people you're playing with. So I find that both really interesting and potentially valuable.
Yeah. Certainly, yeah, maybe more helping people remember how to dream together rather than...
Yeah.
And again, I feel like we're talking about AI again. Like, it's not about wrangling this thing to get it to perform some sort of low noise, perfect execution, as it is about the information that you get by seeing
engagement. Yeah.
Your prompt in a new way. Yeah. And like exploring that space of possibility. In the final moments that we have together today, I guess I'll just ask you, if in light of all of that, how might you prompt listeners to engage more deeply with the ethos of your work? Obviously, I want them listening and I want them reading your stuff, but how might you invite people to enact the world space that you inhabit?
I think I've tried to encode that in my work, so I have put some breadcrumbs out for that. Fallencycle.com obviously is one big entrance point for one particular fictional universe I've been developing for a long time. And modernmythology.net is the other side of that, my blog, where I've been doing... Actually, Modern Mythology used to be a kind of web magazine before everyone was calling it blogs, right? And it was a pretty popular one for a while, and then it became just my personal blog after a while. But that's a big question, though, in terms of how to engage with it that way. Yeah, I don't know. I think part of the reason why I created the podcast, why I'm creating it, is to create sort of an opening entrance point for people, because I've had a number of people, even friends, who were like, you've produced so much stuff, I don't know where to start or how to enter it. So I'm like, okay, let's make a linear entrance point and trace the story forward that way. Whereas most of the Fallen Cycle content is these standalone projects that are all in the same world, but they aren't released in like book 1, book 2, book 3. They're a cycle, and you could start with the third book that I wrote. So that's where I would suggest people enter. Although one other thing I'll mention, though, because we haven't really talked about it, that the Tales from When I Had a Face book we did a Kickstarter edition that was hardcover and full color and has 100 illustrations. That's like a whole, it's the other side of it. We're doing the soundtrack for the audio version, but the book version is also pretty heavily illustrated. So the images are also part of it when you experience it that way. Still trying to get a mass market version of it together that doesn't cost $80. So we're going to do it black and white. Unfortunate, because some of the colors are really nice, but that's definitely the way to do it if you want to keep it affordable.
Yeah, dude, I shouldn't leave this without saying that I am really impressed by your abilities as an illustrator. And yeah, that's just a little button on top of this whole conversation.
Appreciate that. Although certainly it's as much the people I choose to work with as my own, I don't even talents, I guess we'll say, but I definitely feel, I guess that's why Bowie in some ways is one of my favorite artists in terms of his method of working, even more than just the music, because it's like his work was heavily influenced by the people he surrounded himself with, and genius, not genius, right? But
maybe we can make a Jamie Curcio chatbot trained on the Fallen Cycle that can become someone's genius.
If we can get it to not suck. We haven't developed that technology yet. It's so funny with LLMs. It's when you're looking for the patterns or to extend something, like here's something, create more like that. It's fairly good at that. But when you try to give it an open space and here's this thing, riff on that, it so quickly becomes so painfully generic in a way that's not interesting to me anyways. But if that line exists now, I don't know if that's a hard limit or not, because we thought a lot of things were hard limits for machine intelligence that clearly aren't. And in the current state, it's like, whenever I feel like you open it up and say, you do your thing, LLM, it's like, I don't have a thing. Okay, I'm just going to spit this out.
Just makes me wonder, how long could you play a kind of text-based RPG with a Jamie Curcio bot before it would just lead you off a cliff?
That'd be pretty quick, yeah.
Yeah. Well, anyway, dude, speaking of cliffs, thank you. And
happy we got to talk finally on the show.
Yeah. I look forward to rapping with you more while I still have the actual human in my Facebook messages interactive RPG.
Awesome.
Thanks again for listening. Hope you enjoyed that conversation. The last 2 episodes of Future Fossils as We Know It coming up are a trialogue with Eric Wargo and J.F. Martell on the non-linearity of time and art and religion and culture and the creative process. Fascinating episode. I am extremely excited to share with you as a capstone to the last 8.5 years of conversation. Also, I will be sharing my talk from Stephen Reed's course on technological metamodernism as an inquiry into the mythic and magical underpinnings of rational and transrational thought in the 21st century. It's a real smooth, clean lead-in into Humans on the Loop, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Follow up with me, michaelgarfield.substack.com, patreon.com/michaelgarfield, and have a wonderful Aeon.